Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I am Franco, your host, and I'm joined today by Riley Waggaman. He's a journalist based currently in Tbilisi, Georgia, and he's wrote a lot about the Russia-Ukraine war. He's wrote a lot about the Great Reset. And Riley, since this is your first time, why don't you tell us a bit more about yourself and what got you into journalism?
Sure. I
Yeah.
actually started, mm, I guess my first writing gigs were actually in Washington, D.C., right when I got out of college. And it was very lowbrow, sort of DC politics type stuff. And I really became, I mean, it was a very depressing experience for me because you get to Washington, you're like this young, doe-eyed kid, and you realize that it's just no one's actually there to solve anything or fix anything. It's this endless horse race that's really just a race to the bottom. So anyway, I got very disillusioned with that whole scene. I ended up moving to Central Europe for a little bit, just hanging out, doing absolutely nothing. Then I decided one day, I don't know why, that it would be interesting to move to Russia and teach English. So that's what I did. And I arrived in Russia and I said, oh, I'm finally in this secluded area of Russia. Nothing, I'm free of all politics and all geopolitical matters. No one can touch me. And then, like, within a period of 6 months, the Edward Snowden thing happened. And then my dawn really kicked off. So somehow I was in the middle of it all again. And yeah, I ended up staying in Russia and I ended up working for a number of outlets in Russia, including Press TV, which is Iran's state media channel. I was their Moscow correspondent for a little bit. I worked for RT, and eventually I just decided to go solo. So I started a Substack, which is the chic thing to
Yeah.
do these days. And yeah, so that's what I've been up to over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, yeah. So you were living in Russia for a bit, right? How many years was it?
I mean, it's basically 10 years now because I think I
Okay.
first came in 2013, if I'm remembering correctly. So, yeah.
And since you got to have that experience living there, and with everything going on right now with Russia and Ukraine, how would you say the coverage is from people who are in the U.S. or who are um, in like the UK or in the Western region? Would you say that the coverage has been fair overall?
Like what Western coverage? Like
Yeah,
near.
Western independent coverage. Like we know the mainstream coverage is really biased towards Ukraine, but what would you say is how would you say the coverage is in Western independent media? Do you think that it's been more objective than mainstream news coverage?
It'll depend on on the person that you're following. I mean, my
Yeah.
honest advice to anyone who really wants a good picture of what's happening in Russia or Ukraine is just to read Russian and Ukrainian sources. And if you don't speak or understand the language, machine translation really isn't that bad. You're still going to get 90% of what people say. I mean, the problem, in my honest opinion, and this was a problem long before the war started, was because it's objectively true that Western mainstream media is just so like their coverage of Russia is really appalling in the sense that, um, it's just it's basically for them it's a regime change operation. They're out to knock Moscow no matter what it does. The problem, though, is that I think there's a lot of overcompensation within what I guess is called alternative media, where people, because mainstream media is so unfair to Moscow in many ways, there's this tendency to basically just white knight for the Kremlin. And unfortunately, and as we saw very clearly with the with COVID, is that Russia is involved in many, many, many of the same things that people denounce and decry across the Western world. And it's very strange that people don't make that distinction. They look to Moscow as somehow their savior, but the Russian government is engaged in the same kind of shenanigans that we're seeing all across the collective West. So my honest piece of advice is that you'll get a much more objective take just from reading Russian Telegram channels, where it's just ordinary Russians talking about ordinary problems that any Westerner would relate to and understand, you know.
Yeah, like they were pushing for lockdowns and vaccines, and they had mandates. So, what can you tell us about what Russia was doing during 2020, 2021, that was similar, or yes, that was similar to what like the U.S. or some of the other Western countries were doing during that time with COVID.
Yeah, well, they started off, although Russia's lockdowns didn't last nearly as long as they did in other countries. Moscow had one of the world's strictest lockdowns, where you had to get one of these, QR code passes to leave your house, and they even tried doing it for commuters. It was this huge scandal. It didn't really work out that well, thank God. But after the lockdowns were lifted, what basically ended up happening was the Russian government did end up imposing these vaccine decrees, but even more, well, I won't say even more, but equally as despicable is that across the country, they suspended routine medical care, allegedly to free up beds for COVID patients. And this is also something that was done, I know, in all over the world. And as a result of this, people who had very serious problems like heart attacks or other problems were getting, second or third rate care, because the entire medical system had been shifted towards fighting COVID, which, by the way, meant using remdesivir, using all these other drugs that, Russia, by the way, recently approved Paxlovid for treating COVID. That's a Pfizer drug. And this was, I don't know, 6 months ago, And anyway, there was also the same scandals where there was questions about the safety and efficacy of Sputnik V, and there was a lot of censorship about it. Doctors were being threatened and intimidated. I'm telling you, in across the board, it was the same sort of we saw the same sort of medical tyranny that we experienced and was so well documented by the alt media in the West, and for some reason it was just totally overlooked in Russia, and in some cases people defended it. Some people were actually shilling, the Russian vaccine and the Russian approach, and pretending that Putin was, secretly fighting against the World Health Organization. I mean, all of that is nonsense. There's no evidence for that whatsoever.
Yeah, like we can say RT, some they do challenge some of the narratives and propaganda that the U.S. puts out, but we can't pretend like sometimes they do push out their own propaganda. And there were some RT pieces that were citing some op-eds from people from the Russian CDC, or people who were from the young global leaders from the World Economic Forum. Is that correct, Riley?
Okay, yeah. So, the RT sort of COVID coverage was really quite fascinating, and maybe it's actually something we can focus on for a little bit, because it's very demonstrative of, I think, what the problem here is, which is RT made itself a platform for disaffected Westerners to write these op-eds saying, the COVID policies in France are totalitarian, which they are and were, and et cetera, and decrying vaccine decrees across the West. And it was totally silent, of course, about the fact that Russia was doing the same thing. Now, this was on RT International. You go over to RT in Russian. RT in Russian was telling Russians to mask up. They were calling people who questioned vaccine mandates enemies of the people, which is a Stalin-era term for, like liquidating people. It was a huge scandal. It was a documentary that was produced by Margarita Simonyan, who is the editor-in-chief of RT and one of Russia's big sort of pro-government propagandists. There was very famously, RT published an op-ed by the guy who runs a government fund that financially backed the creation of Sputnik V. And people were citing this op-ed, being like, oh, look, RT published this op-ed explaining why Sputnik V is so safe and effective. It's not like these other vaccines. This guy, Kirill Dmitriev, was a young global leader. He worked for Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and Company, and people are citing an RT op-ed written by not just the funder of Sputnik V, but a young global leader being like, oh, look, it's so different. It's so different in Russia. It's just there's so many levels to it. And it's just very weird
Yeah.
that people become so credulous, when it's Russia doing it. It seems like people just suspend all doubt, when we're talking about iffy things that normally people would really be like, hey, that doesn't make any sense. We should really question that. We should look into that. We shouldn't be so trusting. They do that with Washington, and that's the right approach. But for some reason, when, Moscow does the same thing, it's just, I don't know. People are cheerleading.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of my audience members are familiar with what the Great Reset is and how they used the 2020 COVID lockdowns and all these other measures as the opportunity to ramp up the Great Reset agenda. So how would you say Russia is also complicit in the Great Reset agenda?
Well, Russia is basically taken in some ways. It's actually ahead of many Western states. If you just go down the list of, if you read Klaus Schwab's, COVID-19, the Great Reset, where he talks about his grand vision about how we're going to turn this alleged health crisis into, a transformative moment. And you go down the list, you see that Russia checks off all the boxes. First of all, we can start with a really obvious one, a really big one, which is central bank digital currencies. Russia is preparing legislation to legalize that. This is happening in the next few weeks. 13 banks in Russia are already they're running a pilot test. I'm confused, a test for this digital ruble. And you have central bank officials talking about how they're already talking, they want to issue pensions using this digital ruble. By the way, this is the same technology that people are freaking out about in Europe and the United States. And again, rightfully so, a programmable digital currency that's completely centralized and controlled by Russia's central bank, which, can be traced, completely transparent, can be traced to anyone at any time, cannot be exchanged for cash, most importantly. And lastly, Russian government officials have gone on the record within the Ministry of Finance saying the digital ruble is the replacement for the cash ruble. That is the end game. So if you're someone who's really worried about a cashless society, a cashless future, Russia's like leading the pack here. And, that's not to excuse anyone else's behavior here. Apparently all nations in the world are, hopping on board. But it's quite frightening. And again, you could just keep going down the list, talking about, for example, like biometric IDs or digital IDs. Russia has this, not only do they have this smart city program, but they have even a smart school program where they're having children, they get biometric IDs made for children who have to, show their face to a camera to get into their school. Russia, incredibly, actually is quite active in the sort of ESG sustainable development scam, which seems incredible because so much of Russia's economy is based off of exporting, oil and gas. They have some of Russia's largest corporations have created something called the ESG Alliance, where, they talk about putting carbon tax credits on things and, working to create sustainable business models and yada, yada, yada. It's incredible how it's just a copy paste. So much of it is just a copy paste. It's a carbon copy of what you'll see in the West.
What do you say in response to people who say that people like, or countries like Russia and China, or governments like Russia and China will be using this technology for benevolent reasons? That they can't possibly be like how the US and all these other Western countries want to use this technology, that they're going to be using it for good reasons, and that we have to use this technology because this is just the direction that that society is heading in evolutionarily.
This is look, I lived in Russia for 10 years. I love Russia. My son is half Russian. This idea that the Russian government, I mean, I won't even talk about China, which has already clearly shown that they are taking technology, the technological control of people to a level that, God willing, we'll never see anywhere else. But in Russia, I mean, what would make someone think that a country like Russia, with its history, with its past, would somehow be more protective of civil liberties or privacy? Like, where does that idea come from? That's what really confuses me the most. It's like you already have a situation where in Moscow, for example, they have one of the most largest and sophisticated facial recognition systems in the world, where they can basically, they've been using it to catch people who are trying to evade mobilization or who are trying to, where, you're walking through the metro and the camera picks up your face and they flag you and you get dragged away by the cops. I mean, we have systems where it's just, there's no evidence. Like, why would anyone actually think that, for whatever weird reason, like, oh, central bank digital currencies are bad for the United States, but they'll be good for Russia? Like, why would you think that? And what's most interesting, of course, is that there's never been a time where anyone in the Russian government has come out and said, we understand that people are, worried about privacy issues with facial recognition or biometrics, and we're writing down in law ways that we're going to protect you forever and blah blah blah. I mean, they don't even pretend, really. They don't even pretend that they care. And why? And there's this, again, it's not about Russia bad, West good, or vice versa. This is just the reality, of power.
Yeah, it's a false dichotomy. Like people think that, oh, like because the West is bad, because the US is bad, then that means that all these other countries are good. Or it's also wishful thinking. Like they think like, oh, it's there's other countries out there that are legitimately fighting against the US, like other powerful countries fighting against the US, and then when they become the number one economy or take down the US dollar, then things are gonna be better. I think
Right.
it's just people having that wishful thinking. What do you think?
There's absolutely a problem with this false dichotomy where, again, you're told that you have to either choose between the United States or Washington and Moscow or whatever the two. It's always two, right? It's like BRICS versus the G20 or whatever. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, wait a second. If both the G20 and BRICS openly state that they want to, like, continue mass vaccinating the world for reasons which are not quite clear, it's like, why should I have to choose? Why can't I just be pro-human, like pro-prol? I'm for the average guy, American or Russian or Eskimo or whatever. And this doesn't, I don't see where this is going. And it's so similar to the false dichotomy in US politics. Like this idea where, like, if you don't vote for the Republicans, the Democrats will win. Or if you don't, if you don't vote for the Democrats, then the Supreme Court will make abortion illegal, or what, like all these thousands of
Yeah.
ridiculous arguments for buying in to this system where everyone loses in the end. And people keep doing it again and again, you know? And this is
Yeah.
just the same game on a global scale. It absolutely is.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I've made that observation also that they've transferred their energy from, okay, like a lot of these people, they realize that the Republicans and the Democrats are working for the same team, they're working for the same people, and that it's a two-party illusion. But then they transferred that same energy that they had there into global politics, where they think
Yep.
that, okay, um, countries like Russia and China are fighting the good fight, and things will get better, and blah blah blah. Like they're hoping that a party or a country is gonna save them. Um, but it's just we have to see things more objectively, and we can't just mix in our wishful thinking with our politics. Otherwise, that's going to cloud our judgments on reality. But yeah, I have here an article that you wrote. and I thought it was really good because this is not discussed enough in the media space on what exactly Putin and Xi were discussing. So what can you tell us about some of the main things that Putin and Xi discussed?
Well, the reason I wrote the article is because you get these very sort of poetic, like almost works of, I don't even know how to describe them, like these esoteric scribblings about, what this meeting means for the world and the resistance against the collective West and so on and so forth. Well, it's like, all right, fine, I get it. People are, pro China and Russia. They're in this, false dichotomy. But let's just look at what they actually agreed to do. And what you'll find actually is that basically all of it is just they're just sort of re-agreeing to agreements that they've been making every other year for the last decade. Like one of the agreements is like continuing to work on cooperation in like soybean development. Like others are actually citing agreements that were made like in 1997, something like that, where they say, like, yeah, we're going to keep having high level discussions with one another among senior government officials. Others are just very generic, broad, like China will continue supporting investments in developing the Far East, and Russia will be excited about this, or they use this weird diplomatic lingo. The most important thing here is, at the end of the day, this idea that this meeting showed that Russia and China have formed some sort of special like alliance. Just I don't really think that that's what happened here. Overall, it was pretty normal. And tellingly, today, I don't know if you saw the news. This broke just a few hours ago. The New York Times did an article or interview, with the EU, China's ambassador to the EU. And according to the New York Times, he said, look, when Beijing talks about having a friendship with no limits, with Moscow, this is just rhetoric. And he said openly, we do not recognize the territories that have been captured, by or annexed by Russia in Ukraine. We do not recognize the legitimacy of that. We are not planning, we never have and never will send weapons to Moscow to continue this war. I mean, it was incredibly blunt. Now, maybe the New York Times, skewed his words beyond recognition. But again, I think the biggest news from that meeting was not what they signed, which was pretty normal stuff that they've been signing for years. There was a lot of excitement about them using this language like cooperation for a new era. I've got bad news for you guys. They've been using that same language since 2019. Like you can go back and look. Like every other year they sign something called, bilateral cooperation while looking towards a new era in global, friendship or whatever. It's very, very cookie cutter type stuff. Maybe the most interesting thing is this, actually what you're looking at right now is this increased cooperation among state media channels. I don't know if that's been how much that's been happening. And even during my time at RT, I can't really remember us doing much with Chinese state media, although maybe it was like a different department. So maybe that's one thing that actually changed, is that they're going to start coordinating their, state media, programs more closely with one another. I don't know, but I guess my to sum it all up, I think that it's been way overplayed. I think, in fact, that probably Moscow was disappointed with the result of this meeting. In fact, there's this, I believe it's a gas line, maybe it's oil, called Power of Siberia 2, which Russia really wants to build into China because it's lost actually, a lot of its Western clients, energy clients, and China said no. And there are various technical reasons for this, but that was a top item on the Kremlin's agenda, was to get this pipeline, I believe, built, and China said no. So it's even basic stuff like that.
Yeah, uh, as I was reading all of this, and then you also cited like the sources here where you got this. So this like I had to translate it because yeah, it was like directly from Russia. But I see things like UN 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which is something that we hear a lot, discussed a lot in the World Economic Forum, like Agenda 2030. And it says here sustainable development and how the World Economic Forum has co opted that word sustainability and conservation, which is really just going to use technologies that still overexploit some resources through mining and exploiting some countries in the global south for more to ramp up more surveillance, but to also use alternative energy sources that are still destroying the environment. Um, so it seems like they're on board with some of the same stuff that the World Economic Forum is on board with. What do you have to say about that?
Look, even I'm pretty sure in this agreement, and I think that I found the excerpt and included in the article, they talk about how World Trade Organization is critical to
Yeah.
developing. Like I think they even use the phrase they want economic globalization or something like that. But WTO critical. I don't know if they actually said it in this agreement, but in a past agreement from February 2022, World Health Organization absolutely central to China and Russia's friendship with no limits. All of these organizations, like all the major sort of what alt media would probably call like the globalist, the clubs of these globalist plots or whatever, Russia and China are fully on board with, and it's ridiculous to pretend otherwise. And it is quite amazing that you'd have Russia still interested in being part of the World Trade Organization when Russia has been screwed over by like half of WTO members being sanctioned unilaterally without any sort of real like legal justification for it. Like why are they still in this organization? Why is Russia in a global health organization that is funded almost exclusively by its so-called alleged enemies?
Right, with
In the
Gates
collective West or the
Foundation
Gates
and
Foundation. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's like I mean, forget the theories, about like what the WHO's really up to. It's just like a national security issue, you would think, right? Like maybe we shouldn't be taking health recommendations from an organization funded by like allegedly hostile actors towards our own civilization, right? So it's just very, very well, it's disheartening, first of all. But again, all you have to do is just look at what they're actually saying. And you very quickly realize that this idea that Russia and China are building this distinct, they're choosing a different path than the rest of the world, and that they're inviting the rest of the world to come join them on this more enlightened, less, awful future. I just like where's the evidence for that? I don't know.
right, and Xi Jinping and I believe Putin too are listed as agenda contributors on the World Economic Forum website. So it's like, how is it that they're fighting against this when they are listed as agenda contributors? And we see here, like as you wrote, like they're or quoted actually that they are will work together in response to biological threats, and we've been seeing evidence of how this was like a manufactured, or at the very least, they took a huge opportunity to further advance capitalism. So yeah, uh, the year 2030 also keeps getting brought up. Um, any other thoughts that you have about the meeting that they have had?
No, I mean, I think we covered most of the big topics there, but yeah, I mean, again, just as something for people to think about. I really encourage people to try to think a little bit more deeply about this issue and not necessarily buy into this idea that Russia and China are, one big happy family. they're on this distinct team, and that they're somehow fighting the people that you don't like, in a way that would make your life better. I just don't know if that's really what's happening. You know?
Yeah, yeah, and also um, a lot of people who watch the Western alt media, Western independent media, have bought into this idea that Russia initially went into Ukraine to denazify the region. Or actually, before that, they're like, they just want a buffer region with Ukraine. Then, when they went in to Ukraine, it was about denazifying Ukraine. But then they kept going further and further east of Ukraine. So what can you tell us about that? And not to mention also how they work with the Wagner group. So what can you tell us about that?
Look, I mean, it's such a what has happened, what we've all witnessed in Ukraine over the last year is really, it's still difficult to even sort of process what
Yeah.
seem to be seemingly impossible things have happened over the last year. I mean, if you even go back to just a few weeks or days before February 24th, when Russia launched its so-called special military operation, you had like people saying that if you thought that Russia would invade, that you're some sort of CIA shill. And I remember Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, was said to suggest that Russia would attack Ukraine was a form of informational terrorism. You know, and the reason why, and by the way, I I think the reason why Moscow was saying this at the time, maybe Lavrov didn't even know that Russia was going, is because according to Russia's foreign policy doctrine for the last 10 years, the idea of war with Ukraine was impossible. It was seen as the most destructive possible thing that Russia could do. Like, there was a recognition that there were serious problems that needed to be addressed, but war was totally off the table. You have an interview with Sergei Lavrov from 2018, and this was after Zakharchenko, I believe his name is. Um, he was the former leader of the Donetsk People's Republic, who was assassinated. And this was I believe in August 2018. A few weeks later, Lavrov gives an interview to a very upset Russian press corps, and he says, "Listen, people who want to go to war with Ukraine need to chill out, because what would happen is that in the best case scenario, we will get the breakaway republics, we'll get Donetsk and Luhansk, and the rest of Ukraine will become a permanent anti-Russia, and that this would exacerbate all of the problems that already exist, between our two countries." And what we see now is possibly the worst case scenario, because Russia, even after a year of fighting, for some reason which I do not understand, still has not been able to push the Ukrainian military out of Donbass. So people who say like they went in to protect the Donetsk from indiscriminate shelling, okay, yes, I mean that's terrible. I was in Donetsk twice in 2015, and yeah, it is terrible what it's war crimes have been committed against civilians in Donetsk by the Ukrainian military and like paramilitary groups, very, very seedy, bad people. That these attacks haven't stopped. In fact, they've increased. And apparently Russia can't do anything to stop it. And at the same time, it has almost made it. It's almost guaranteed that whatever remains of Ukraine after this conflict will be a permanent anti-Russia. So somehow Russia has seemingly accomplished everything that it set out to prevent, right? This idea of a neutral Ukraine, of a Ukraine that can't be used as a sledgehammer by the West against Russia, of a Ukraine where there can, at the very least, be some kind of mutual cooperation between, what historically have been brotherly states. And in fact, I mean, many would argue that Ukraine, I mean, the big pro-Russia line is that Ukraine doesn't exist, that it's part of, the Russia, historical Russia, and that it should return to its roots, So I sort of went around your question a little bit, but I guess my main point on that is just this war, unfortunately, doesn't seem to have made anything better, If you're coming at it from the side, if you're sympathetic towards Russia, Unfortunately, my assessment of the situation, and by the way, it's also the assessment of many, many, many prominent Russian pundits within Russia who live in Russia and write in Russian. The problem is that this war has not, if we can agree on these goals, alleged denazification,
Yeah.
demilitarization, preventing, creating a neutral Ukraine, none of these goals have been accomplished. And in fact, many of them, likely, these problems have gotten worse. As for Wagner, it's absolutely incredible to me that you have this war, which seems to be almost existential at this point for Russia. Whether, I don't think initially it was meant to be that, but I think it has become that now. And you're relying on a PMC, as if you're relying on Blackwater to fight an entire war for you. Wagner is, according to reports, basically the only force on the ground that is actually trying to make territorial gains at this point. And there's infighting allegedly between, I would say it's been very well documented, between Wagner and the Russian defense ministry. It's a very, very weird situation. And it's so interesting to me that people don't talk about this. And the fact that Wagner recruited convicts from penal colonies. By the way, there are reports of these guys who, if they survive for 6 months, they basically get a pardon and they get sent home. Some of these guys go back to their, hometowns in Russia and start murdering people, and who did any Russians agree to this? Was there any debate about whether it was okay to pardon, murderers and rapists and other criminals to go fight in an alleged, war to denazify Ukraine and then send them back home? It's just so bizarre, Franco, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And it still puzzles me very deeply that people don't understand what we're witnessing is quite profound. And I think that we're going to see more and more of this in the future, and not just in Russia. These basic private armies, carrying out allegedly the will of a government, although who can say at this point? If the Russian government relies on a PMC to fight their wars, who's actually in charge?
Yeah, yeah, and how they're controlled by an oligarch also. We can't deny that there's despicable people on both sides, like the Azov Battalion, like we hear talk about a lot, and how despicable that group is. But yeah, we also can't deny how people within the Wagner group are also like that, and how there are innocent people that are getting killed here. Another question I wanted to ask you is that there's a lot of people who are saying, oh, we need a multipolar world in order for us to live in a better global society. Would you say that we already live in a multipolar world, considering the power that Russia and China currently have?
I have to say I don't. What is your? I'm curious. Not
Yeah,
trying to quiz you here, but I'm genuinely curious.
yeah,
Like, what is your definition of multipolar world? Because it's been used. It's used like for everything
yeah,
now. I don't even understand what we're talking about anymore.
yeah, yeah. Like I only heard about it for the first time when I heard a lot of commentators and alt media starting to use that. Like, we had to fight for a multipolar world, and channels naming their channel after that word, multipolarist. What they're trying to say is we currently live in a unipolar world where it's just the US that controls everything. And from what I've seen is that it's not just the US that has power. Like, Russia has some power and they have some influence in countries in the global south, in Africa, in the Caribbean. Same thing with China, with Caribbean, Africa, South America. Um, I and then even before that, when the United Kingdom was a bigger empire than it currently is, we had countries like France and Belgium who also had a hand in countries like Africa and other countries like that. So my argument would be that we've always had this multipolar world. It's never just been one country had solely all the power to control everything. But people think that the U.S. currently has like all the power to, oppress all these nations. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that the most important. The question people should be asking here is not even whether we're in one or not, but why would someone think that in a world where Russia and China, let's say, have a more prominent role in international affairs, why would they necessarily think that that will lead to a more peaceful world or a more prosperous world? I mean, if we're to believe that Russia and China are, this sort of these altruistic, benevolent forces on the global stage, why are they providing material support to Saudi Arabia as it carries out a genocide in Yemen? Like
Yeah.
we already see that that China and Russia are playing the same very you know, I mean, it's the same dirty games that other countries play, that their so-called geopolitical rivals play. This idea that they're motivated by, peace and prosperity and kumbaya and all that stuff. I mean, I have to say that, and I don't mean to offend anyone by saying this, but it really does remind me of this sort of noble savage, idea from, when people would romanticize, the faraway natives, with their loincloths in some other country, and like, oh, like if only we lived in this other world where everything would be, there's like there's this great different place out there. If only we could go back there. And it's like, guys, Russians and Chinese are also humans. Unfortunately, we haven't changed very much in the last 3,000 years. We're motivated by the same things, greed, power, jealousy, paranoia. And why on earth would anyone think that of all the elites in the world, for some reason Russia's elites, who have really done a bang up job for the last few years just in Russia, where, by the way, is suffering one of the worst demographic crises in Russia's history, modern history. So if they can't even take care of their own people, why on earth would you think that the Kremlin cares about you or your safety or your prosperity or your kids,
Yeah, the more accurate way to look at this is like it's a Game of Thrones kind of thing, but there's still other people that have some power. Because what was I gonna say about that? Like, it's not going to change the current level of collective consciousness of the world. Like, the people at the top are still gonna be like, there's still gonna be corruption. There's still gonna be people that don't have their greed in check. Uh, the rulers of this world, like for example, the like BlackRock and Vanguard Group, like they're still the people who own those firms are still going to be around. Um, until we fix our state of mind, our collective consciousness, where the world isn't going to become a better place. So that's what we need to work on. We need to work on uplifting people's consciousness so that we don't have a repeat of what we had with the UK empire and the US empire or whatever other empire that has existed throughout history. Um, so yeah, I mean, we're not gonna, and I've said this before, we're not gonna fix the world if we don't fix ourselves.
Yeah, well said, man. I totally agree. I totally agree. And this,
Yeah,
I think that it's very natural for people to, they want a savior. They want to believe that someone's out there looking out for them. And I'm just saying, especially if you're American and you've gotten over the, the whole Republican Democrat thing and you understand that it's a scam, and it is a scam. It's the same formula. It really is at the end of the day. Yes, there are cosmetic differences. There are differences between the Democrats and Republicans, by the way. And they have, some of the, for example, I loathed Barack Obama. Barack Obama did some okay things though. Barack Obama did some things that I thought were, pretty okay, like dropping sanctions against Iran. I thought he's a war criminal. I think he should have been, thrown into prison for the rest of his life, just with Bush and all the rest of these
yeah,
scumbags. So, look, I don't know. I guess for me, it's sort of like, where's your red line? Like, at what point do you say, obviously, supporting these people is not leading to anything good? And you have to sort of be able to detach yourself from this horse race, which again, in my opinion, is just a race to the bottom. It's just to see who can get to the bottom a little bit slower than the other side. But we're still heading in that direction.
yeah, yeah, 100%. Yeah, I also think these people should be locked up. People who were like Pompeo, all those guys gotta be locked up. Um, but Yeah, I mean, we got to look at things nuanced. Like China may be doing there may be some good things that they're doing, but we can't deny also how they still can be exploiting other countries or have so much control over their citizens. Same thing with Russia. In the U.S., like this gets discussed ad nauseum in the alt media space. All the bad things that the U.S. does. So Riley, is there any final message you want to leave the people with?
No, I mean, listen, I just really encourage people to, again, just think, maybe instead of trying to, justify things that you think are wrong and make no sense and are damaging to, us humans, we should have a little bit more backbone, all of us. Just say, look, no, like this isn't okay. Like
Mm.
this doesn't, when people are fighting, and the fights get quite vicious on the internet, about Russia and China and the US and Ukraine and so forth. It's like, what are we actually fighting over? Why is this actually why should I even, take a side in this ridiculous slugfest, which never seems to actually work out in the interest of ordinary people? Why is it that Russia is still pumping gas across Ukraine as allegedly they're fighting the Ukro Nazis and the Ukrainians are fighting the, Moscow orcs or whatever? How is it that it's business as usual for the oligarchs on both sides? That's the perfect. That's just one of many examples you can point to and say, look, I don't know if I have a horse in this race. I'm for the average Ukrainian. I'm for the average Russian. I don't think we should be killing each other. I don't know why in a special military operation you haven't taken out all the top Ukrainian anti-Russian oligarchs. It's like, what's going on here, guys? Let's start asking some questions.
Yeah, yeah. Like people say, oh, I want this war to end, but the only way it can end is if Ukraine surrenders, or like the
Right,
freaking
right.
people in the U.S. like who are bought into U.S. propaganda say Russia should surrender. How about we ask for a complete ceasefire from both sides? That I think that's the principled stance to take if you're truly for the people, like you were mentioning, the average Ukrainian, the average Russian. But yeah, thanks again, Riley, for coming on the show. Oh, and I also recommend people to check out on the Off Guardian Rockfin channel to check out the panel discussion that Riley was in with Ian Davis versus Matthew Arrett and Tom Luongo, and it was moderated by Whitney Webb and Kit Knightley. It was a great discussion, and I think that we could all come to a better understanding if we hear those sides that were participating in that panel discussion. But yeah, Riley, again, I appreciate you coming on, and everybody else stay informed.
Thanks for having